Hi everyone, we are going to start. Welcome to Women's International League for Peace and Freedom webinar on feminist foreign policy. My name is Barbara Terenowska and I'm the coordinator of the WILPF Academic Network. But before I introduce the webinar today and our excellent speakers, I will very quickly take you through some technical issues in case you join us today for the first time. So first of all, you are all muted, so we can't hear you and we can't see you, and this is how the program works, so it's okay. But there will be time for you to ask your questions, either speak them out loud or type them, but I will explain how that works just before our Q&A session. If you encounter any problems, if you can't hear us properly, or if you can't see the presentation, please try to force quit and log in once again, and hopefully it will help. And finally, we are recording this session to put it online later, so please keep that in mind if you are going to ask a question or make a comment. So this webinar is hosted by the WILPF Academic Network, which is a global think tank of researchers and peace activists who all work on various topics around gender, peace, and security. And we are guided by the belief that feminist research can improve peace activism, and also that experiences from feminist peace movements can enhance scholarship and teaching. So we basically envision this mutually beneficial relationship between research, activism, and teaching. And if you would like to get to know us better, please go to our website, and you are also, or you can send me an email with any questions about the network. So our topic today is feminist foreign policy, and this is our Women, Peace and Security anniversary webinar. Some of you might be unaware that just a few days ago we celebrated the 15th anniversary of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And this was the very first resolution of the UN Security Council that made explicit link between gender equality and international peace and security. And although there have been some gains over the last 15 years, much remains yet to be done. And foreign policies of countries largely investing in military spending are of our particular concern. But I won't keep you any longer. I will just now introduce the first speaker. So Madeline is a British lawyer who has worked extensively in the field of discrimination law. She served many different posts, including the head of the office in Bosnia and Herzegovina and gender expert for the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then she helped to expose human rights abuses and sex trafficking by UN peacekeepers, and she was portrayed in the 2010 feature film The Whistleblower. In 2014, Madeline was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire for her services for human rights, women's rights in particular, and international peace and security, and she is the current Secretary General of WILPF. Madeline, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes, just 1 second. You should get the webcam request now.
That's it, I'm on.
Okay.
Share my webcam. There I am.
Okay. Yeah, go.
Ready to go? Well, good evening, good morning, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. Thank you very, very much for joining this webinar. In my introduction, she says, I received the Order of the British Empire, that most excellent order of the non-feminist foreign policy. But we are going to talk and celebrate, I hope, the development of the concept of a feminist foreign policy. And I say that as someone who is always intrigued by something which is new. And to a certain extent, it is rather sad that we've come all these generations since the ending of the Second World War and the Charter of the United Nations and all the human rights frameworks which have flowed from that. And still there has never been a feminist foreign policy articulated. So we really are in uncharted waters, and that's what makes it so exciting, because it means that we have the possibility of really framing something new here and transformative. That's the good stuff. As Barbara said, we have just celebrated, if celebrating is the right way of putting it, the 15th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325. I was part of the advisory board for the global study, which was launched just 2 weeks ago in New York. That study, as some of you may know, commissioned a vast number of papers, academic papers, practitioner papers, and held several, at least 7 consultations with civil society organizations to understand better what the reality of the implementation of 1325 looked like. What was working on the ground, what wasn't working on the ground, what were the real concerns of women living in conflict, pre-conflict and post-conflict. What was actually happening? What was actually, I think, the most amazing and important elements was how very unsurprising the outcome was. Everyone or anyone who has been engaged in feminism for even a very short period of time will have realized that so many of the things that we take for granted are quite surprising to those who have never engaged with feminism. One thing that came up very strongly from the academic research was that feminist organizing works. It does lead to change. It is the one thing that does lead to fundamental change. And that was particularly true of looking at how women have organized against issues of domestic violence, sexual violence. The research, the empirical research, particularly that conducted by Tanya Pfaffenholz, showed that women's participation in peace processes, but real meaningful participation, and when they are dressed up in a feminist social, economic, and cultural movement, does lead to fundamental changes in which sustainable peace is possible. And absent the participation of women, sustainable peace just doesn't happen. You end up with frozen conflicts, you end up with a change of the distribution of power only amongst the hands of the men, between the men who carry the guns. So it doesn't work. So without women, it doesn't work. How very unsurprising for those of us who knew better from the beginning. The other thing it showed very clearly was you don't get that participation unless you look at the structures of society, unless you look at the political economy within the society from a gender perspective. You look at power, basically, as simple as that. You look at power, who's got it, who wields it, to what, and in what sphere. And that obviously is highly, highly gendered. It showed very definitively that when societies are more equal, there is less likelihood of violent conflict actually being used to solve issues of dispute. It also shows that when there are more women in structures, in the government structures, those countries are less likely to go to war. All of which, I think we could have said without having done the study. But it's there now. We have empirical evidence to underpin what it was that the women were telling us. But more importantly, what's not in any of the resolutions and came out of the global study and very much articulating the concerns of civil society, and that was the militarization elements. Militarization being the enemy of feminism, being the enemy of human rights and equality, not least because of the enormous amounts of monies that are poured into the so-called security, which is born of militarization, but particularly because of the prevalence of arms in communities which prevent equality and underpin violent masculinities. It helps to create and perpetuate gender stereotypes and freezes them in positions of power. Those were the basic issues that came out of the global study. I would invite you all to read it. It is a mere 400 pages and some more annexes attached to that. And then there's something like 26 commissioned research documents to go with it, which does mean this is pretty fulsome in its analysis. It's a roadmap, really, of how we could make those fundamental changes. Which brings me back to the feminist foreign policy. Essentially, what I've just said is the framework that needs to be tackled. A feminist foreign policy should seek to undo the rigors and structures of militarization and political economy, which is highly masculinized, into one which is fundamentally different. Margot Wallström, bless her, walked straight into the absolute sharp end of all that is about patriarchy and institutional obstacles. It was a brilliant microcosm, if you like, of how feminism comes up against the traditional roles of states of the member states of the United Nations, but in more particular ways, the way in which they do business with each other. As we all know, her venture was in relation to human rights in particular, and the treatment of Saudi dissidents, and she had the gall to call it medieval, which is what we all call it, and what every leader calls it behind closed doors, but she was brave enough to do it in public. And then she was brave enough to say that they would end the cooperation agreements with the Saudis unless there were improvements. She basically crashed headfirst into the system. And as a result, we could see exactly where the fault lines were going to arise when it came to bringing feminism and feminist foreign policy into that rigidity. Major obstacle, first of all, it was the politics of the region and the politics of the due deference to the Saudis by all states, because they happen to control the oil, and they're also major purchasers of arms and other goods from other countries. Also brilliantly exemplified by the fact that it wasn't just those who, from the arms industry, who would have been who were worried by her venture into human rights discourse. It was the likes of Volvo and the other companies who we wouldn't necessarily have associated with militarization and with arms deals or with human rights abuses, but who are dependent upon the sorts of trade that is done, the sort of deals which are done with arms companies to open the doors for them to then come in and then develop their own markets. It showed absolutely how men in power and men in hierarchies across the board, from the politics to the multilateral system, to the companies and to the purchasers, are actually representative of a particular form of international politics, which does not create an environment for feminism. So the institutionalization of the arms trade was a major issue in relation to all of that, and so that's where the damage was done in relation to how to do it. The damage, the obstacles were really put in the way of how we could change the system. It also showed the hypocrisy of all the other member states, because, as I said, everyone was saying that Saudi is a medieval state. No one can really endorse the use of the sorts of human rights violations which are an everyday occurrence in Saudi. But if Sweden was going to suspend some of its trading, the free market capitalism of the neoliberal agenda meant that every other country was ready, willing and able to jump in and fill the gap in the market to take over the contracts which would be lost. It's the system. And the problem with the system is there could be hand-wringing amongst those who are in power, but basically they're not able to think of ways of changing it. It's a system which exists. It's a system which is like a shark going forward. And there's a fear of changing it, because if you change it, you may lose some of the power within it. The solutions then have to come from the outcome of the global study and feminism. It's not going to happen overnight. I think that's the other thing we have to be realistic about. Those of us who are very frustrated that Security Council Resolution 1325 is not up, running and implemented everywhere know and knew from the very beginning that a transformative agenda, which is what was being set out, was not going to happen overnight. The feminist foreign policy doesn't happen overnight. It needs to be built. And what are those building blocks? And we put them on a slide here just for ease of access. At the core of any feminist foreign policy must be human rights. not least because it will address the issues of political economy from a gender perspective, because we have the laws that we need. They exist in the human rights bodies. They exist in the human rights documentation, and they can be monitored and implemented through the use of the multilateral system and through national courts. We need to ensure there is access to education, health, employment, and economic activity from a non-discrimination element so that women have access to all those rights. It's quite clear, and I'm particularly moved at the moment because I saw that he named me Malala last night, and the amazing work that she has done to promote the education for girls in particular. What a difference that makes. It will change, does change fundamentally how women can enjoy power. If we have education, if we have particular rights to health and reproductive rights, if we have access to employment, then there is much greater chance, and if there is rule of law in relation to the sort of security that's needed, then there is much greater participation in governance structures because the obstacles start being removed. Then we are back into the findings of global study, greater participation, changes in governance, changes in foreign policy, less likelihood of going to conflict, and so on and so forth. Ending militarization slowly over time by changing the system which facilitates it. Fundamental to that, absolutely fundamental, is the adherence to international law, which has been thrown out of the window over the last 10 years or so, as states seem to prefer, as the United Kingdom has done, subordinating human rights to trade policy. These are the sorts of things that bring international law into disrepute and mean that we lose our direction. We lose our moral and our legal compass as to how to navigate international politics and justice and accountability. So we need to absolutely insist on and enforce the adherence to international law. That's what feminist foreign policy would look like. International law reflecting international obligation based on human rights and the absolute obligations for equality. One thing that is absolutely fundamental, again, to all of that, must be consistency. It would be totally hypocritical and wrong to say in one breath, we support human rights, and then to undertake, as again the United Kingdom has done, increased trading with those countries where the violations of human rights undermine equality, undermine the ability of civil society to actually function. So the point of feminist foreign policy must be to focus on building through development aid, building through trading agreements, building through refusal to sell arms, transfer weapons, transfer technology which could be used towards militarism to those states where there is no protection for human rights. It's as basic as that. It takes time, but there must be consistency, and how that is used through the multilateral fora. So it would start in your own nation state as to how you conduct relations there. It would then move through into the relations, the way you conduct your business in the multilateral fora, including and particularly through the international trading blocks, and then through your development assistance policies. All of that, if done consistently and coherently, and with the long-term vision, would absolutely fundamentally change the way in which states relate. It's not going to happen anytime soon. It's going to need the support and encouragement of all of us who actually believe in democracy and the absolute necessity of including civil society in pushing for these reforms. And people like Margot Wallström who take this on need the support of those of us who are advocating for the same changes. I will leave that for now and leave it for Annick to go ahead and give more in terms of the fundamental substance of what a feminist foreign policy would look like. And we'll be open for questions at the end of the next session.
All right. Thank you, Madeleine. That was very interesting. And now I'm going to unmute our second speaker, and I will introduce Annick in just 1 second. Okay. So our next speaker is Annick Wibben. She is a dedicated member of our academic network. and she is Associate Professor of Politics at the University of San Francisco, where she also directs the Peace and Justice Program. She researches and has published broadly in the area of critical security studies and feminist international relations. And she's known for her groundbreaking book, Feminist Security Studies and Narrative Approach. And finally, Annick is also the founder and coordinator of the Feminist Security Studies Network. Yes, and Annick, you are unmuted.
Okay, great. Hi, nice to see everybody. Well, actually, I don't see anybody, but nice to be seen, I guess. So thank you, Margaret, Madeline, for that sort of introduction to the more sort of specific policy elements, because I think it's really important to keep in mind sort of the reality and then sort of the excitement that many of us feminist scholars and activists have at this moment about the announcement of Sweden that it was following a feminist foreign policy. Now, before I sort of go into some of the concerns I have and also some of the ideas I have about where we might take this, I do want to point out that we have had some feminist writing on what feminist foreign policy might be, and I'll be drawing on some of that today, and then also drawing on broader ideas of feminist scholars in terms of other areas of research that might be relevant here. So as you can see, I think you now have the first slide in front of you. The big question of what is a feminist foreign policy that some of us are discussing right now, we can draw on some research that has happened sort of in the early 2000s. For example, Lisa Ann Richley proposed that a policy orientation or practice can be described as feminist to the extent that it recognizes the power and value imbalances that exist between men and women, and importantly, that it promotes more active women in an attempt to foster balance. And Lisa Ann Richley was writing about Danish foreign policy at the time and sort of suggesting that it might indeed be feminist. So what she said at the time was that feminist foreign policy would propose gender mainstreaming and agenda setting. And really what we've seen in the last 15 years with regard to the Women, Peace and Security agenda post the passing of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 are efforts at gender mainstreaming and of course also agenda setting. Now there is a wealth of research by lots of feminist scholars, some of whom might be currently commenting on Twitter, hopefully, that points to, both ways in which the agenda of 1325 has been very successful, and also ways in which it has fallen short of some of the ideas that feminists really were hoping for. So how does this relate to feminist foreign policy? I think Madeline already talked about that a little bit, that really we could characterize 1325 and the subsequent efforts both by feminist activists and researchers to be involved with that agenda as feminist foreign policy at the level of international organizations. Now, one of the problems with this definition of feminist foreign policy that we have here is that it seems to remain fairly basic. So I want to propose a second definition for feminist foreign policy. And Barbara, if you could put up the next slide, that would be great. So in this slide, as you can see, I'm drawing on the work of Solander, Smith, and Stienstra. They wrote a book in the early 2000s, and I actually have it here if you want to see it. The book is called Feminist Perspectives on Canadian Foreign Policy. So while Canada never claimed to have a feminist foreign policy, these scholars actually were talking about efforts by feminist scholars and activists in Canada to do feminist analysis of Canadian foreign policy. And in the introduction to this volume, Solander, Smith, and Stienstra ask that we should maybe think about when we think about analyzing foreign policy from a feminist perspective, what kind of gender, ethnic, racial, and class positions are privileged in foreign policy? And if you think about that for a moment, you might realize that they're very particular, right? Very often, foreign policy is actually made by men, highly privileged men in various positions. And when we think about how we study foreign policy as scholars, there are very sort of limited ways of thinking about foreign policy. Now, what Sjolander, Schmidt, and Stjenstra ask us to do is they say, well, what if we did ask these questions about whose positions are represented here? And also, what if we didn't just take the traditional ideas of where foreign policy is located, but thought about what other places might we find relevant foreign policy ideas? So, for example, in good feminist fashion, right, we might be asking about the linkages between domestic and international issues, right? So, for example, in the area of sexualized violence, we see this. What are the linkages between, you know, those who subject their own families to domestic violence and sexualized violence, and those who go out into the world and do similar things elsewhere? Are there linkages that we can find? What about the ways in which certain states spend money on social services at home? How can those same things maybe be adapted internationally, right? What are the linkages between, say, at this particular point, we could think about, you know, German wealth and German weapons exports, and the way in which Germany is currently dealing with refugees? Can we make those linkages? What would those linkages tell us about where foreign policy might look different? I think we can do this very well from a feminist perspective. And what these scholars propose is that integrated feminist analysis, an analysis that really takes feminist insights very seriously and then promotes a transformative agenda, would be the way that we could look forward as we try to define what feminist foreign policy is. This also, I think, would help with the complaint that some scholars have had about the agenda that is often captured in so-called national action plans that different countries develop to implement and sort of further the agenda of women, peace, and security, which are often actually oriented towards the global south. So they're oriented in the very kind of what we might call an imperialist or colonialist framework, where the North, in quotation marks, right, the North has figured out what it can do, and it helps the global south achieve these. If we took seriously this idea about the linkage between the domestic and the international, we might also ask that more countries pay attention in those national action plans to how they can integrate the kind of ideas promoted in UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the subsequent resolutions in their very own countries, right? We haven't figured out all of these things ourselves, so who are we to necessarily tell other people how to do this? Also, if we have figured out some of these things, these solutions are very context specific, right? All solutions are always context specific. So if we really ask that question that they ask us to consider, what gender, ethnic, racial, and class positions are privileged here, we can also ask those same questions about domestic policy, and we can make those linkages from a feminist perspectives. So what I'm proposing here really, and Barbara, if you could do the next slide. Next slide. There we go. Is that we might consider going beyond adding women. I think the first definition that I gave you, Lisa and Richie's definition, where she asks us to promote more active women in fostering the balance. An integrated feminist analysis, as Deborah Stjenstra describes it in the book I was mentioning already, shifts the discourse from focusing exclusively on women to focusing on the ways in which intersections between gender and race, ethnicity, ability, class, sexuality, nationality, and religion, these things produce very specific forms of oppression. So people are located in these specific forms of oppression differently, and so it means both domestic and international policies have particular impacts on them depending on how they are positioned here. So what I think is really, really important, and this somewhat speaks to the question of where are the men in all this, which is a question that has come up in recent debates. You know, are the men allies? Should we be looking to also, for example, address sexualized violence against men through mechanisms of the women, peace, and security agenda, which absolutely we should, right? The question is how, right? Do we focus on women only in one particular way, or do we actually recognize that some of us, for example, myself, located in the global north, highly educated, very privileged in many ways, have very different needs and thus need different kinds of policies domestically and also internationally than others, right? So what I'm proposing is that as we promote this agenda, which is somewhat problematically named the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, that we really think about it in terms of a feminist foreign policy that integrates an intersectional analysis and an intersectional politics. And so maybe, Barbara, if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more what I mean here. So what I want to propose is that as we formulate what a feminist foreign policy agenda is, we go right away to a critical and engaged feminism, not what I'll describe in a moment as a feminism of totality, but a critical and engaged feminism, a feminism that really seeks out the marginal stories. And I would propose that it seeks out marginal stories for two reasons. On the one hand, marginal stories are important because they matter and because we do not hear them enough, right? So we do not know enough about how foreign policies by different countries are affecting those differently situated people who are identified as women. But we know a little bit, and I think one of the things that academics could do would be to bring out more of these stories and make sure that we know, just at a very basic level, right, that we just know a lot more about what is happening. For example, taking the Swedish initiative, the initiative of Margot Wallström that Madeline was already talking about. It's been widely reported in the press as being a limitation on all sorts of arms deals with Saudi Arabia, which I think the WILPF Sweden folks will tell us a little bit later is actually not true. So what is really the impact of this particular policy? And what really would be the impact of limiting arms trades? And what kind of arms are we talking about? A lot of feminist research actually points to the importance of looking at small arms, right? But shouldn't we also be looking at nuclear weapons? And what are the differences here? And how do they impact us specifically? So for the first point basically being that these stories matter, we don't hear them enough, but they have important consequences. What is more, and this is sort of an insight from my previous work, is that these stories tell us very much about how the center functions. So it is in the marginal stories, when we look at how those on the margins of society live their lives and the kind of obstacles they face, that we actually realize how the center functions. Like, what are the things that are considered normal? And when we think about foreign policy, we can think about what are the things that are considered to be normally part of foreign policy, and what are the things that we don't normally actually consider to be part of foreign policy, right? The modern state system relies on a lot of violence to keep itself up. We constantly have wars because the international system that was divided in particular ways, mostly during colonial times, right, doesn't actually really serve the interest of those living within it. What would be some really alternative ways of thinking about this? I think feminist researchers who are located in universities have the time to really think these things through, and we should take that time. Okay, so it's not enough in a way to change just a few, add a few women to the already existing systems, right? When we think, for example, about this very important, crucial point of bringing more women into peace processes, right? We also need to think about what parts of peace processes are we talking about? Are we just talking about that very limited bit where you sit at the table? That's important, definitely, really, really crucial, right? The research has shown that it is crucial. But maybe we also need to think about those everyday kinds of work that women do that are really, really important to sustain the peace process over a long time. And to recognize that those are actually also part of what we need to be looking at, right? So we need to transform taken for granted system of what it means to think about foreign and security policy making. Okay, please do ask me some questions as we move to the conversation later. I know this is a lot to sort of digest in a very quick presentation. So, Barbara, maybe we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm basically pointing to here, I think, in some way is a paradox of thinking about feminist foreign policy, right? So we have a very critical tradition in feminism that really points out that the state and the way that the international state system is organized today really is actually part of the problem. It's part of what makes women insecure, because the state more often than not is heavily militarized, because the state institutions, its ideas about foreign policy, where it's located, its ideas about what it means to be secure, these are all heavily masculinized, right, and heavily militarized. So the state in some way is part of the problem. Yet when we are talking about a feminist foreign policy, and whether we're talking about it at the level of states, so at the level of Sweden, for example, or Denmark, or some people have asked whether Hillary Clinton might pursue a feminist foreign policy. I'm skeptical. But when we think about it at the state level, or whether we think about it at the intergovernmental level, so the question of at the UN or other such institutions, we can think about NATO mainstreaming gender through using UN Security Council Resolution 1325, right? We are now working within state institutions, or maybe not within, at least with state institutions. And that means we are, at the one hand, criticizing the state itself as an institution, and on the other hand, we're saying, well, but given that there are no other options at this point, or that these are our best options, right? These are the institutions that also have money, right? They have power to make these decisions, right? We're also working with the state. And the problem here is that the analysis and what we can do in practice don't always work hand in hand, right? So that means we need to be really, really careful not to lapse into what Vivian Jabri has called a feminism of totality. And the feminism of totality believes what I was criticizing earlier, that we can identify once and for all what's good for other people, right? We can identify that it would be better for women to do one thing and not another thing. But if we take into account a real intersectional understanding of feminism, then we can never really say, right, that one solution will work for everybody. And that's really, really important, to consider that the solutions have to actually come from those that we are trying to help, if we want to frame it in that way, right? That we cannot transplant ideas necessarily from one context to another context without taking into account that the solutions that work really, really well in our case, or might work well in one case for particular people, which is very often the case, and then take them into another context, right? So the idea that we could, without taking into account what's going on locally, have a feminist foreign policy, a singular idea of what that would mean itself, I think is problematic. Now, how do we get around that? Well, we do what I just said, which is we seek out all those marginal stories, right? And we not only tell them ourselves, but we work with those people that are on the ground, that know the particular context, and we work from there. The other danger that I see is the danger of co-optation. And as Barbara mentioned in my introduction, most of my work has been in security studies. And one of the things that's been really noticeable in about the last 10-15 years, particularly during the so-called war on terror, is that we have a feminist war narrative. Madeline was talking about this earlier when she was talking about the sort of danger of militarism and the danger of how militarization really is the enemy in some way of feminist work, right? And so one of the dangers is that feminist ideals get co-opted to further war. And we saw this very early on in the 2000s when Laura Bush went on the radio in September, it was November 2001, I think, and basically said, oh, well, we are going into Afghanistan to liberate women. That's why we have to fight this war. Right? And we see this again and again, that there's sort of this understanding that intervention will somehow make things better for women. And I think as feminist scholars and feminists interested in foreign and security policy, we have to ask some really tough questions, because we do know that for the most part, more violence actually doesn't solve anything. Okay. I think I kind of leave this slide here, and maybe we can talk about it later. It's very dangerous, basically, if we are using feminist ideals in the service of some of these imperial agendas. Now, I want to end on a positive note, and maybe you can put up the next slide, Barbara. Okay, so what can we do, right? What can feminist scholars in particular do, and how can they support activists? And many of us are not, just feminist scholars or just feminist activists. I think a lot of us do a lot of different things at different moments. But I want to say that there are sort of three areas that I see where feminist scholars can support this agenda. So one, I think it's really, really important that while we are critical, we also really applaud the commitments of those, and hopefully the actions, right, of those who are embracing a feminist foreign policy. And we can do so, I think, in a manner that is, is thoughtful and sort of recognizes the limits of what can be done within particular state institutions, but also really recognizing that some very basic things will already make lives a lot better, right? So in Margot Wallström's sort of layout of her feminist foreign policy for Sweden, she talks about maternal rights and also reproductive rights, for example. I think it's really, really important to consider that just the simple fact of providing, funding for midwives and other services will make a lot of people's lives better. Providing funding and support for girls' education will make a huge difference, right? We have a lot of research, it's quite old research actually, that tells us that if women are more educated, everybody does better. Right? So there are some very basic things that I think we can do, and I think it's important, as much as I just said, right, we really need to have a more critical lens, to also recognize that there are some basic things that make a huge difference. I also think, and this is the second point, that those of us who are interested in these agendas, we can help, right? We can help in some way, those pushing for and implementing a feminist foreign policy by providing the relevant research. For example, the kind of research that was just put together in the global study, which I tweeted out earlier, by the way. So we can provide the kind of relevant research, specific policy advice, and even strategic insights, right? So maybe we are really interested in reproductive rights, right? And maybe we do believe in the maxim of feminism that, you know, until women have control over their own body, you know, other things will be secondary, right? But we can also see that maybe there are incremental steps to getting this done. How do we get there? What are some of the specific policies that we can use to make that happen? And then I think, and that's kind of what I was talking about a little bit today, I think we also need to challenge both feminist and non-feminist foreign policy makers to integrate critical scholarship more. And this is a struggle because, of course, if the scholarship is critical of the state system itself, the states might be hard-pressed to actually adopt that kind of a framework. But they might still be able to adopt some elements of it, right? They might still be able to recognize that, you know, state intervention might not always be the best course of action. I also want to stress that I don't think these three things are mutually exclusive, right? I think we cannot maybe do them all at the same time, every single one of us, but I think as a feminist community of researchers and activists, we can and also must in some way do all of these at the same time. And of course, right, consider whether or not it's possible for any one of us to really be in all of these areas. But I think it might be really fruitful if we had the conversations at these different levels. I want to say one last thing, which I think is really, really important when we talk about feminist foreign policy, when we talk even about some sort of semi-basic things, such as gender mainstreaming through all of these different areas. The only thing that's really going to make a difference is if these objectives are located sort of at the highest ranks of government. So the fact that Margot Wallström has taken this on as a project for the Swedish government makes a huge difference. Now, the next step would be to make sure that these initiatives are actually funded, right? Because if we don't fully fund gender mainstreaming, but we just sort of add a gender advisor somewhere and you know, nobody ever listens to them, or we just add the idea of women in some place and we don't really think about how women are differently located in different places, then these are not really going to change anything, right? So the full funding and the full commitment at leadership positions to these agendas is really, really crucial. And that's, I just wanted to make sure I echo Madeleine's point there because I think it's absolutely crucial. So yes, I hope that was somewhat helpful and coherent, and then we can maybe talk and have more questions after our next speaker.
All right, thank you, Annick. That was very insightful. Last but definitely not least, we are having with us Ghazal Rahman-Panah. I'm just sharing your webcam. Ghazal is Peace Women's Program Associate, and Peace Women is the Women, Peace and Security Program of WILPF. Ghazal holds double master's degree in international policy studies and international economics, and she has worked both as media and research analyst and consultant with focus on disarmament and gender mainstreaming. She has field experiences from India, El Salvador, Cuba, and Iran. Ghazal, the floor is yours. You are unmuted.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this webinar. Very excited to participate. So what I'm going to be following up our two incredible speakers, Madeline and Annick, is more about how you can get involved, how everyone can get involved in what we're referring to as October and beyond. So, as you all may know, October was a monumental month here in New York for Women, Peace, and Security agenda. There were a lot of anniversaries, high-level reviews, post resolutions, and things like that. And so now, as we move past this WPS month in October, we want to make sure that 1325 at 16 becomes October and beyond, and we can keep the momentum going as best as possible. So for my presentation, I will keep it brief. I'm going to just touch very quickly on what happened in the last month here in New York, and then a breakdown of moving forward how sections in WILPF and others, advocates, women, peace, and security advocates, can get involved in October and beyond through monitoring and advocacy. So, and Sarah, you can push it on to the next slide. So, in October, we had the about 3 weeks of Women, Peace, and Security events. During week 1, we had the open debate on Women, Peace, and Security in the Security Council under the Spanish presidency. This was a groundbreaking debate. There was a record-breaking 110 statements from member states and multilateral organizations and institutions. There was 3 extraordinarily effective civil society statements and conventions. And finally, there was a unanimous adoption of a new resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 2242, which had a whopping 75 co-sponsors, 75 member states co-sponsored it. So looking at UNSCR 2242, if you look at it on paper, it is very strong. It is true to the civil society language that we have sought and asked for, the calls to action recommendations, many put forward by the NGO working group on Women, Peace, and Security within the roadmap and the open letter. So on paper, it expresses this intention to integrate the WPS concerns that we all bring up into a more holistic approach, more across all country-specific situations, and as well as integrating more or greater engagement with civil society. However, what we've come to find, as Annick spoke of a little bit earlier as well, is that the rhetoric is there, but the reality is not. So while we have our discourse is in place and it's become quite successful in getting the council, for example, to say what we want them to say, they are not doing what we want them to do. So how do we move past this into a more effective manner? So as I mentioned, during week 1, we had the resolution and the high-level review. There was also the official launch of the global study on 1325 implementation. This was critical for many reasons. First and foremost, I believe it gave a lot of the statistics and scientific data behind what we in the Women's Peace and Security agenda, or the advocates, have been saying for quite some time, that you need women at the table, you need effective, full implementation of women's participation across everything. And this goes beyond just the peace processes, but also looking at the integration or participation of women in disarmament. There have been quite a few, there's been quite some research done on how much more effective disarmament initiatives are when they utilize gender mainstreaming. And the global study.
Speak a little bit louder because we have a bit of a background noise. So if you can please speak a little bit louder, okay?
Sure.
Great.
Sure, absolutely. Sorry about that. Is this better? I hope. So as I was saying, so that was the global study. And with the global study, several member states made national and financial commitments to the implementation of 1325. But again, going back to what Annick was mentioning of the militarization of the feminist foreign policy, or potential of that, a lot of the financial commitments were very focused, for example, on countering violent extremism and counterterrorism, which is a very holistic umbrella term that can be exploited quite easily, as we all know. and many of the financial commitments were quite weak, if not just reiterating commitments that were already made. So, as mentioned, the rhetoric is there, but the action is not. In the second week, due to the shift of the debate by 1 week, there was what we deemed here as the Civil Society Week. So during this time, we had delegations that were sponsored by WILPF. Kavina to Kavina had a delegation of members here, and GNWP. These were women advocates, civil society representation from across the world, global south, global north, here engaging together. And it was a great week because there was a lot of information sharing and resource sharing and talking about the best practices. So during these civil society events, our delegations with other delegations worked together and really shared on what works and what is wanted in order to move forward. And that really culminated into this call to action that resulted in the final week, week 3 of the Peace Forum. And all in all, there was a consistent theme behind what needs to be done in order to move beyond the celebrations of October, and that was to really focus on monitoring but focus on advocacy. And so from here I'll talk a little bit more about what we need to do next. And I think the best quote for that came from the Norwegian Secretary of State, Ton Skogen, who stated during the global study launch that it's no longer about counting the women, but making the women count. So how do we now strategize after this month of reviews and anniversaries, now that all the mechanisms exist, they're there, how do we move forward? And I've broken it down into monitoring and advocacy because I believe that for feminist foreign policy to really work, we must demand for accountability from the international and national institutions. We must demand for rhetoric to manifest into reality. And a prime example of that is, as was mentioned with Ambassador Wallström and her decision to embrace the feminist foreign policy and agenda, but there's still being so much left to be done. And while the decision by the government was there to halt a prolonged military cooperation with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Swedish government is still one of the major arms exporters in the world and still has not made any concrete decision to stop selling arms entirely to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So as we can see, even with our heroes, contemporarily speaking, there's still a lot needs to be done. And within that, there is the breakdown of advocacy and monitoring. And Barbara, you can go to the next slide. So, so as Madeline mentioned about the framework of a feminist foreign policy, moving forward, how do we implement that? So thematically, the best way is to look at it from a monitoring and advocacy standpoint, to look at monitoring and advocating for a integrated feminist foreign policy, an approach that successfully relies on this holistic platform of integrating human security overall. Another element of this is that engagement with men and boys. And another element of that would be, as I mentioned, women's participation in disarmament. So really looking at it holistically, how do we monitor and how do we advocate? And so this all is very dependent, if you will, on the right resources. So from an advocacy standpoint, utilizing resources that already exist and contextualizing and localizing them, such as global study summaries, advocacy toolkits, making these more contextual seems to be an effective manner in order to do what needs to be done. Another method, Barbara, can you go back to the last slide? Sorry, not there yet. Yeah, so as I mentioned, best practices and information sharing. With regards to monitoring, sharing country progress reports, accountability on commitments, if your country was one of the member states or states that made a national or financial commitment, are they staying true to this? And also relaying information on the relationship that the national government has with civil society. I think that has been a major concern, the suffocation of civil society space. And so ensuring that a strong relationship exists, collaboration exists, as per the resolutions that have passed, is also very, very critical. So finally, also, as I mentioned, through monitoring, it's a good way for proponents of the agenda to hold their national governments accountable, and for commitments to be held accountable for also the commitments and the implementation of 1325. It's been 15 years, and we're still demanding a lot of the same things. So it's really time to demand for action. So finally, I'm just going to talk about really shortly just a few of the resources that already exist and some that will be coming soon. So Barbara, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So some of the resources that already exist through the Peace Women Program Project and WILPF especially, we have an advocacy toolkit that I highly recommend utilizing. Feel free for sections to localize and ask for feedback. We've already provided this for 1 or 2 sections already. Plan to do more, so I'm happy to provide any advice or help in contextualizing these kinds of resources. We also have a social media packet that includes some key messages and visuals and infographics that can be shared widely, along with hashtags and partners that you can reach out to and collaborate with through social media. With that also, we will be working on these Facebook storyboards to kind of give a more holistic picture of what happened in the last month of October. And with that also, we have member state commitments on the Peace Women website, where you can see every commitment made, both financially and politically. And you can also see who sponsored and who didn't sponsor 2242. And as Madeline says, we should take the non-sponsors to the Human Rights Council. So the tools are there. It's just all about using them. And finally, just a few other things. So we have already completed a global study summary and analysis through the SG report. That's available online as well. And just an analysis of the latest resolution that's been added to the WPS agenda. That has also been created. There's visuals for that. And so some of the things that will be coming soon are more thematic breakdowns of the commitments made to see where the balance lies. We're going to also be looking at member state financial commitments and comparing them to military expenditures, other visuals that we will be providing. Hopefully in the near future, we will also be working on some, not webinars, but informative videos for how to use the social media, for example, as that's been something that's been asked a couple times. So the trainings and things like that, and all of these are resources that are available through Peace Women and WILPF, and we hope that they are used and contextualized. And finally, also just recently launched our scorecard, which this year we focused on the P5, permanent 5 members, and Spain as the October president. So please share and review and look widely. And finally, just as a conclusive remark, as Charlotte Bunch said during the civil society conversation with Radhika Kumaraswamy, who was the lead author of the global study launch, we need to take back our discourse. So it's been 15 years since 1325, and there's still so much that needs to be done. And really the time is now. We have the mechanisms, we have the tools. It's all there to advocate for what we want, but we have to go for it and make sure that we hold these governments accountable for the rhetoric that they are putting out. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaza. That was incredibly interesting. Now we are moving to our Q&A section. So we are opening for your questions and comments. If you've got any questions, you can ask them in 2 ways. You can either raise your hand through clicking on the button with a hand icon in your control panel, or you can type it and I will read it out loud for you. We'll give you a few minutes to ask questions. We already have one from Norway. Let me just unmute all our panelists. And especially if you have any questions to Madeleine, please ask them now because she will need to leave us earlier. Okay, I can see one question from Norway, from Elizabeth Christiansen. And Norway looks so good on the outside, but our new national action plan is only exported as aid and support. There is no 1325 agenda domestically. How can I criticize this without losing our finding? So I'm wondering if any of our panelists would like to make any comment.
Just a point of clarification, without losing your funding, does that mean that you're working for an NGO funded by the government and therefore are concerned about criticising it?
Elizabeth, I will unmute you so you can ask the question and also clarify it. Elizabeth, you are unmuted.
I'm in my living room. Can you hear me?
Badly.
Yeah, badly.
Of course, we are partly funded by the Norwegian government, but I find that they give us money and then sort of not really want to take our advice.
So I didn't catch the last part of that at all.
Maybe you can type it.
Try again.
Okay, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is writing that we are founded, but not really. Okay. Elizabeth, why don't you just write the whole question once again, because we really can't hear you, and meanwhile we will get another question. Okay. David Duresmith, I'm going to unmute you. You are unmuted. You can ask the question now.
Hi, it's David Duresmith from University of Melbourne. My question was directed towards Annick Wibben primarily, and what I was wondering is, with these, what you're proposing, isn't there a challenge here where you're actually looking at feminism pulling in two completely different directions? One around specific issue politics, trying to resolve maternal health or education or sexualized violence in conflict, and the other one proposing a kind of structural critique of the whole system of international politics and masculinist states. If that's the case, how can these two things be easily reconciled without compromising the objectives of one another?
Yeah, I think the key is easily. I don't think they can be easily reconciled. I do think we need to do both things at the same time, right? Because one of the sort of the concrete problems that you name, maternal health and so forth, these are really crucial issues that affect a lot of lives, right? And these are issues, some of which can be addressed fairly, not I don't want to say, that they're very easy to address, but they're much more easily addressed, I should say, than dismantling the entire state system, getting rid of borders, thinking about gender differently, and so forth and so forth. But we also know that, for example, maternal health, right? The places where maternal health is a big issue are also places where women in general are not taken as seriously as subjects of their own right, where there is very little tolerance often for fluidity of gender more generally, where basically we have very strong patriarchal norms, sometimes very strong religious norms that reinforce those patriarchal norms. So we cannot really do we cannot do the concrete policies without also making sure that, you know, women need to be educated, but that requires that it gets considered important that women are educated, not just so that they can get a job, but also because we consider them to be human beings in their own right who deserve to have an education, right? And there needs to be a broader understanding that that benefits everybody. So I don't see them as opposing necessarily. I do see them as intention when we're talking about foreign policy, which is so closely tied to our understanding of the current state system and what states do. So that's why it's also important that those of us who maybe are not as concretely involved in the day-to-day of, you know, delivering aid or formulating a particular policy for a particular context, that those of us who have the luxury of taking a step back think about, you know, what would be some of the ways in which we would want to challenge the broader structures of the international system and the state system, so that we would have fewer problems of this particular kind. So I think that the tension here is actually potentially productive if we can stay in conversation with each other and sort of check, you know, our abstract understandings of how the state system functions with the very concrete ways in which foreign policy exemplifies those particular ways in which the state functions, and recognizing that, you know, we really need to seriously, as I'm a scholar of international politics, we need to really seriously consider how our disciplines themselves are actually founded in these colonial histories, and to challenge them quite significantly. I hope that helps a little bit.
Could I just jump in quickly, Barbara? Is that allowed?
Sure.
Yes, because I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that we're all going to be wrestling with for some time, because my immediate reaction would be, you know, Agenda 1 will lead to Agenda 2 being fulfilled. So basically, if you deal with political economy, if you have real equality, and you address the concept of violent masculinities, and actually do the sort of work that's being done by men's organizations to actually change what we see as being masculine values into something which is different from the one that we are given now, then automatically that will lead to a shift in the way in which policies are reflected from national to international. But the jury is most definitely out on that one, because certainly from what has happened so far, with the numbers game being played, those women who have gone into the international system have not changed it. We do have certain situations where, in fact, you know, we have not changed the system because we have been co-opted in it, very much like Annick said in her presentation. The danger of co-option is there, and if we are just being grafted into a dysfunctional patriarchal system, we're not going to make any difference at all unless the groundwork has been done in that first phase agenda. And that, I think, is where we really come down to looking at the way we deal with the whole structure of powered relations. That's much more complicated, it's much more long-term. It does need the funding, it does need the commitment, and we have to then have, the vision is not getting more women into positions of authority. That's not the end goal. It's one of them, but it's which women and how, which men and how, and what are they representing. And that really comes back down to how are we dealing with the basics of education, how are we dealing with addressing violence against, you know, especially very young children at a very early age, because that manifests in different types of violence later on, and so on and so forth. There is enough research that needs to be done, and enough that has been done to indicate the direction we need to go in. But I think that it's a cautionary tale, and it's a tension that we have to be very astute at actually identifying and dealing with, because otherwise the project could go badly wrong. We just have women doing what men do now, and none of us benefiting as a result.
Yeah, which actually has been the way that, you know, this has worked out in some cases. So
yeah,
we do need to be very careful.
Yeah, be careful who we get and why.
And to hold them accountable when they're there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we are going to take another question. Marilu McFedran, I'm going to unmute you. Marilu?
Oh, I don't know if I think I'm listening only.
Oh no, we can hear you. Just please.
Oh, you can? Okay. Quick question to Madeline before you leave. I'm sorry I missed part of your description around holding the non-supporters of 2242 and what might be possible in terms of the Human Rights Council. Is there a formal complaint underway?
Hi, Marilyn. No, what our thinking was much more subtle than that. And that is that basically we should, because there is no accountability mechanism,
right.
You know, the Security Council resolutions are only there as they exist and they apply, but they don't have to be applied because there's no accountability mechanism, so circular argument. But what we're thinking is how we could devise accountability mechanisms based on the human rights components upon which the Security Council resolutions are based. One would be that, you know, basically when states apply to become members of the Security Council, of the Human Rights Council, the failure to have acceded to the Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security would count against them. Same that with the CEDAW committee, when states are reporting to the CEDAW committee, they would be questioned as to what they have done to ensure the fulfillment of the obligations under Women, Peace and Security agenda, particularly in relation to General Recommendation 30. So it's really using human rights mechanisms to try and get accountability for Security Council resolutions, which is tortuous, but it's at least it's a way of trying to get the system to work in a way which is a little bit less segmented than exists at the moment.
Thank you.
All right, we will get back to the question from Elizabeth, the earlier question. So the question is how to address the lack of 1325 agenda in Norway. It's only export-led. So I think what Elizabeth means that there is a lot of outward-looking focus, not inward-looking. So how to address it, and her earlier questions, how to criticize this without risking losing governmental funding.
Do you want me to take that?
Sure.
I think this is one of the great things about the national action plans. Nearly all of them start at the border and go somewhere else, but they don't actually look at what's happening within the state. And of course, the whole discussion we've been having is what happens in the state helps to formulate what the foreign policy would look like. You know, everything we said about coming from the global study, what the levels of participation, etc., help to frame the sort of policy, the policies that would be developed. So that a national action plan has to look internally in order to be able to express itself externally. And one of the big things, obviously, is what are we doing with our trade? If it doesn't do that, then it's missing one of the most fundamental elements. The national action plans need to look at domestic policy in relation to how it conducts its trade, how it works with the various elements of militarization, particularly the arms trade, but also the technology which is sold. It needs to engage on those at national level, and it needs to actually ensure that that is being monitored so that it is in accordance with such international legal instruments as the Arms Trade Treaty. So it's about holding governments accountable for end user certificates and so on and so forth. There's a multiplicity of different things that need to be done domestically, and there is the whole domestic agenda of looking back to that I seem like a boring mantra repeating myself, the political economy, the distribution of power. That's part of 1325 because that's part of participation. How can you do that without prejudicing funding? It's called positive and constructive criticism. There is never any fail-safe to say that, you know, if you criticize a government that's funding you, they're not going to withdraw the funding. And we're in that position all the time. But I like to think that because we do it in such a way which is actually constructive and points out how much better it would be if it were done differently, then that doesn't mean that they have to withdraw funding from us. And I think it should be the same across the board. Not so naive to think that right-wing governments don't behave differently to the ones that we would consider to be normal people adhering to human rights norms. But one lives in hope.
Okay, great. Any other panelist wants to comment on this? No. Okay. We will take 3 questions now, and I will get back to the panel. We have a question from Maya Eichler. Maya, you are unmuted.
Oh, hi everyone. I just had a quick question for Gazal. I was wondering whether the list of best practices shared during week 2 was available.
Gazal, that's a question.
Hi. Sure. Sorry. So the list of best practices isn't available yet, but it's part of our follow-up to October is to put together a one-pager to go with all of the resources that I mentioned that will touch base on that. But the majority, like in terms of best practices, some of the major things that were brought up was just you know, the need both to contextualize from a bottom-up approach, so taking the more, like the institutional mechanisms, for example, like global study recommendations, and how do you then cut and paste or do a chop job to take what is contextual and localize it to make it useful for you. And then after that, to then start a conversation with other advocates in other country situations to see how they've contextualized it, because that seems to be, while a no-brainer to many, is kind of one of those things that falls on the wayside and needs to be done more holistically and actually really thought about, because we all maybe take the resources or mechanisms or recommendations and create a contextualized best practice for us, but if we then share that information with other sections or other country-based situations, however you want to phrase it, then you're opening up that platform to make, you know, just a better information sharing resource center in the long run. So I hope that answers your question.
All right. Now I'm going to give the floor to Simona Getova. Simona, you are unmuted. Simona?
I'm not sure if you can hear me,
yes.
But as a climate justice activist, I'm wondering how do you see feminist responses creating a paradigm shift for the climate justice movement when it comes to international governance around these two issues. And you spoke a lot about intersectionality, and I loved all of your presentations. Thank you so much.
Okay, we are going to take 2 more questions, and before I get back to the panel, Maria Villas, I'm going to unmute you. Maria?
Hi, this is Maria. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, this is Maria from Spain. I am curious and I wanted to ask you if you know of other governments that are making feminist foreign policy statements, or in other words, if Margot Wallström has been successful in making feminist foreign policy attractive or relevant to other governments.
All right, I will take 1 more question. There are some typed questions. We have one from Rosalia. She's interested to know whether anybody is familiar with the Minerva initiative and if they have any views on militarization of knowledge production in regard to terrorism studies. And she's asking because she's currently writing her PhD on this. Yeah, okay. So we have 3 questions now. One was about intersectionality. 1 on other governments' foreign policies, and the final one on the Minerva initiative. So, would anyone from the panelists would you like to start?
I'm happy to jump in on the first one, attempt to answer that one, because it's a very good question, but a difficult one to surmise in a short time. There is no question that the whole question of climate justice is a very fundamental element of any foreign policy. Should be one of national policy as well, but that's where the coherence comes. It's putting the monies into, again, we're seeing the refusal to put sufficient funding into the reduction of CO2 is one of those classic conundrums which a feminist foreign policy would have to address. not least because of the impact, the gendered impact of climate change. We've seen that in terms of the driver of conflict, as a driver of displacement, as a driver of economic migration, all of those things which Europe really doesn't want to acknowledge, but is having to accept, but then calls it something completely different than what it actually is, which is people seeking asylum. But I think that the basic point is that if we're looking at an integrated foreign policy, then looking at climate and environmental degradation has to be in every element. So if you're looking at trade policy, you don't do the sort of trade that would lead to environmental degradation and destruction, same as you wouldn't do trading policies which would lead to exploitative labor. It would be on a par with that sort of rights protection, particularly given the element of security from a gender perspective, which is integral to actually addressing the abilities of women to participate then in societies and in governance structures and do all the things we were talking about earlier. So, short answer of a complicated system, but just to say one other thing, also integrating it within accountability mechanisms. I think that one of the most difficult things about climate justice is there isn't any, because there's no real fora in which you can adjudicate it. And I've become a very big fan of Rosalind Higgins and her work to try and get crimes against the planet, environmental crimes as part of the statute of the ICC, so that those companies, those states that actually engage in environmental degradation can be held criminally responsible. I think that is the sort of thing we should be looking at in order to make sure that it's not just a wish list, it is actually something which has teeth. And on the second question, sorry, I don't know any other state that's taken on a feminist foreign policy, but I hope that I'm wrong and there is someone.
I can jump in as well. I think the first question is really interesting. Also, one of the sort of debates, activist organization and so forth that I've been following is the sort of indigenous activism around environmental issues and climate justice. I think if you look to the north of us here, I mean, I'm based in the US, so to Canada, but also to Latin America, we find that indigenous populations are, partly because they're maybe still living much closer or in closer contact with the environment than those of us who live in boxes and cities. They're very much aware of these issues, and they have always, I guess, worked on these issues. And I think we could think about intersectionality. I don't think that was one of the things that I put on my slide, but also think about indigeneity and think about what impact these policies have on indigenous populations and what kind of knowledge these groups have that we could integrate much better into whether we want to call it a feminist foreign policy or something else. So I think that's a really important aspect of thinking about environmental issues and climate justice, and it's one that gets neglected very much. There are some claims that others are or have been doing feminist foreign policy. I think it depends a little bit on what we mean by this. Valerie Hudson has written a book recently talking about Hillary Clinton's time at the State Department and noting that some of those things that she did there might be considered part of a feminist foreign policy. I think we might want to look at that very closely. The last question is, that was nicely formulated, wasn't it? The last question about the Minerva initiative, I think it's so highly problematic. It recalls many of the elements of the, failed but not really failed, but now resurrected in the Minerva initiative issues around the human terrain system and the efforts at counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. So I think it's highly problematic. I think the work of the anthropologists on this issue is very important. But I think it kind of goes beyond maybe the the topic of this seminar, but whoever asked the question, if you want to message me or email me, we can talk more.
Okay, I'm going to read some questions. One question from Natasha: how can we concretely in academic research measure or analyze feminist policies? And another one from Joel: hi, I would like to ask, coming from Sweden, whether the fact that Swedish foreign policy is explicitly labeled as feminist is important, and if so, why?
Oh, can I just jump in on that one, because it's a great question, love it. And I'm saying that because when they launched the global study, and when we launched the global study, it unfortunately became a rather embarrassing pledging meeting by member states. But the Swedish ambassador stood up and he said, I'm standing up because I wanted you to know what the representative of a feminist government looks like. And that was very powerful. It was really it was one of those moments where you think, aha, now this is something. This is a something moment, because it was embraced by just about everybody in the room. Nobody sniggered. Everybody was actually quite impressed by it. So yes, I think it has made a difference. And the thing is that I was in Sweden fairly recently to a meeting convened by Swedish CEDA, and how wonderful it was to have all those women who were were allowed to be out feminists, in fact, being totally encouraged. And the thinking and the research that's going into it. I want to get a Swedish passport until they cut the budget, of course, which I believe they're doing on the aid budget as we speak, which will undermine the ability to deliver on feminist foreign policy. But I think that, yes, it's made a difference. Yes, it has definitely made a difference. And I think we will ultimately start seeing countries at least sneaking bits into it so that they can claim some degree of credibility with the constituency, because women are going to start demanding it. Well, men are going to start demanding it as well, because if we see that feminist foreign policy actually would lead to a better type of foreign policy, and one that adheres to the sorts of values that we are aspiring to, then others will eventually start joining in. And I was really, really impressed.
Yeah, I would actually agree completely. I think naming is very important, right? So saying it is a feminist foreign policy has already shaken up those very structures that I was talking about earlier, that, we now have to consider, oh, wait, it's not just foreign policy. What kind of foreign policy is it? And what does it mean for it to be a feminist foreign policy? Which then leads to the other question about measuring and analyzing foreign policy. If we have some sense of what, the parameters of a feminist foreign policy are, then we can also analyze foreign policy on those grounds. And I think in some way we have done this. I was pointing to the book about Canadian foreign policy and the analysis that my colleagues in Canada have done of that policy from a feminist perspective. So in some way we already have some of that research, right? And a lot of the research in feminist security studies and other feminist research in international political economy and so forth is in some ways already doing it, but because we didn't have a name for it, it might not have been recognized as such. So I think as we're, sort of getting to grips with this, new name for something that some of us have maybe done already, and we're beginning to identify more clearly what are some of those elements are, we can then also say, this is how, different countries are actually measuring up to the standards or are not measuring up to the standards. And I think it's very worrisome that Sweden has come sort of forward with this great agenda and is really quite committed to it. I mean, I was just in Sweden myself recently speaking about feminist foreign policy, and it was a very interesting discussion. But if the government at the same time is cutting the funding for these initiatives, then, without funding, nothing can happen. So that is another element where, civil society and activists have to really pressure governments that they have to put, it has to be visible at the highest levels of leadership, and that sets a tone, but it also has to be backed up with the right kind of funding, or it'll just remain lip service.
Okay, and the other question, which was probably specifically to you, Annick, was how can we concretely measure or analyze feminist policies?
Yeah, I was trying to address that a little bit. I think there is a lot of research already out there. I think we just do what we always do as feminist scholars. We sort of think about what are the important feminist ideals and commitments that we want to measure and consider as we analyze any subject, right? So the crucial part here is, we already have, foreign policy analysis as sort of a way of analyzing foreign policy. What would it mean to, add a feminist perspective to that? And I was suggesting earlier that we also might want to look at policies and places that are not immediately obvious to those who normally study foreign policy as foreign policy, right? And I gave the example of peace processes, for example, where, if we only focus on the formal negotiations, we're missing a huge chunk of work. And I have lots of scholar friends all around the world who do this work. So I think anybody who's interested in this should start reading feminist international relations work, should follow hashtags like FemFP or FemSixth, Feminist Security Studies, should maybe follow the FTGS ISA Twitter, which is the Twitter account of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the International Studies Association, which often tweets out the work of scholars who work in this area. So there's a lot. If you're new to this topic, you could also join us on Facebook and so forth. So there's a fair amount of work out there that could be a starting point, I think.
Thank you, Annick. We have a few more written questions and one from Marilo. And also we have a few more minutes, so in case you have any more questions, please raise your hand and I will give you the floor or type them now. The question from Marilo about best practices. Has there been consideration of the term best? Who makes this judgment? Will the examples remain best when they are contextualized? And another question from Alma Rondani. Can it be demanded that NAP's national action plans include refugee migration issues and women's girls' rights protection? Does this fall in the Women, Peace and Security agenda or not?
My answer to Mary Lou's question is I agree with you completely. There's no such thing as best. Constantly evolving, we hope, constantly improving, and the best we can hope for is that there will be some good practices which can then be not replicated but can at least be contextualized, and strands and things learnt from them and then applied. But best, I think, it's a dangerous way of going. And on the second question, national action plans and IDPs, of course, national action plans should include such things. There is, under 1325 itself, there's a recognition of the particular vulnerabilities of women as refugees and IDPs. It's one of those ones that seems to have got lost in translation, again, because of the same issue was raised earlier, that the national action plans to start outside the border rather than being dealt with at home. And if we're looking at the situation now in Europe as in relation to the asylum seekers, if there were national action plans which were actually reflective of what 1325 and the following resolutions say, then there would have to be a different policy. We would make the case in any event that international law has obligations, hard law obligations within it, which would mean that the reception of asylum seekers has to be very different from the one that's being afforded at the moment.
Yeah, and I would reiterate what Madeline said as well. By, I guess, best practices isn't the proper word for it, but yes, good practices, good methods and methodology in order to be more effective, efficient, to avoid duplication, and to then look at what could be contextualized in terms of opportunities and successes, what can be contextualized and localized in general. So yes, best practice is not the right word, but good practices and feasible successes and what can then be replicated and effective across the board.
Okay, we have one more question, and we also got a few thank you comments, and one from Helena Nyberg. Thank you, Annick, for highlighting the importance of indigenous people's knowledge and participation that needs to be included in the issues of climate justice and environment. So I'm going to read out the last question, and then we'll get back to the panel for the concluding remarks. So the last question is from Joel. Is there a risk of the watering of the feminist concept if the policy doesn't live up to its promise in the case of reduction of funds? Yeah. So is there a risk of the watering of the feminist concept if the policy doesn't live up to its promise? And
there's a question.
Sorry, and your concluding remarks as well. So.
Okay. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll go first because it's way past my bedtime. I think that that's it goes back to what Annick was saying about co-option, and the worrying thing would be if the feminist foreign policy doesn't live up to expectations, then it will be seen to be just another one of those fads that goes out of fashion. And feminism itself has had that challenge. You know, we have the post-feminism, we have the backlash, we have all of those things, and yet it's never really gone away because it is a political movement. It's up to us to give the support, and I think this is more in line with concluding observations. But I think that there is now an opportunity for us as civil society organizations to get behind the concept of a feminist foreign policy, which would not then fail. Because we have to be cautionary as to how we approach it. As I said in my earlier remarks, we can't expect it to be transformative immediately. This is going to take generations, and it's going to take time to spread. And what we need to be doing is to constantly be assisting, supporting, and guiding, if you like, to make sure that the foreign policies which are genuinely feminist are the ones that we support, and not the ones which could then smack of co-option. You know, the numbers game, the easy trade-off of watering down certain principles, particularly on human rights, in relations to appease trade unions at home. You know, there are things that I think that have to be fundamental to a foreign policy, which is ostensibly feminist, which cannot be lost, and that we have to be prepared to critique it when they are. But also, as I say, to be part of it. It's this inside and outside organizing that we keep talking about, which is not to throw everything into the basket of the nation state and of the multilateral system, but to retain our independence from an ability to work outside of those systems, so that we can retain that independence and be able to critique, advise, support, analyze, and hold accountable where we can, and hopefully together we'll be able to come up with the sorts of elements of the foreign policy which will be feminist and will have an endurance which, you know, will make then a fundamental difference in the way in which the world works. But it's going to take us time. I think that's the thing. We can't just do a quick 5-year stint and then say, oh, it didn't work, move on. No. And a cautionary note, there is a lot of work to be done within the structures of the multilateral system. Having spent that time in New York fairly recently, they just don't get it. They're absolutely not convinced by it. And it's you know, I would say it's almost like an essential part of their being, whether you're talking with the Department of Political Affairs, the Department of Peacekeeping, or the majority members of member states. They'll do the rhetoric, but they don't feel it. And I think this is the thing, this is our challenge, is again and again. We've given empirical evidence, but now we have to actually show that it can be made to work, and they're going to have to come behind us rather than us waiting for them to take the lead on it.
Thank you, Madeleine. Annick?
Yeah, I would agree pretty much with everything Madeleine just said there, and also, I mean, sort of hoping that we can continue this conversation, because I think the crucial part now is, so I laid out at the end of my presentation the sort of 3 elements that I see that kind of have to happen at the same time and in constant conversation. And I think what Madeleine was just saying in terms of, you know, we have to sort of take the lead and take people along, I think that's kind of, it's going to be tricky, because we do need the funding for that, and with the funding, you know, come certain ideas, and the funding will also only come if we actually are already in some way convincing. So I think that you know, the only thing we can do is really remain vigilant as we go along, and you know, if people are claiming to be feminists but they're not feminist in the way that we sort of understand feminism, then to point out that, you know, that's not good enough, and ask them to think harder and work harder. So I don't think, you know, it's sort of like all feminist work that's been ongoing for quite a long time, you know, that, you know, we sort of continually have this conversation and move the conversation further, and that there will be, you know, I might say one thing today and sort of develop a whole research project on one thing today, and then there should be enough room for the next person to come in and question, you know, whether those assumptions made sense in the first place, or whether, you know, maybe looking at foreign policy from a completely different perspective might actually make more sense if we're trying to really get feminist ideas to make an impact. And I think that's, you know, leaving the conversation open enough that this kind of constant challenging also of each other can happen. That to me is very crucial, and it does require the inside and the outside, and it does require having the conversations amongst ourselves as well.
Thank you.
But I'm hopeful.
Ghazal?
It's difficult to be the last one to make remarks, because Annick and Madeleine both just said everything I needed to say. But yeah, I think, you know, as I mentioned, it's the time is now. We must demand action. Madeleine is absolutely 100% right. They are not recognizing it. They're not feeling it. So while the rhetoric is there, the discourse is where we want it to be. The conversation has moved to where we want it to be. There is no action. There has not been that reality that we're asking for. So taking concrete steps to demand that national governments, institutions, UN entities, the system, everything stands by the words that they're putting on paper and saying, and all of the strong condemnations and, you know, strong concerns that they love to say here in the Security Council. This needs to really formulate into an action, and really become something concrete. And now more than ever, with the rapid changing and evolution of conflict in and of itself, this conversation is even more critical than ever before. So we must demand for some action. We must demand for this rhetoric to become reality.
All right. So thank you very much. First of all, thank you to our excellent speakers for your incredibly interesting contribution, but also many thanks to all participants and your brilliant questions. And we obviously hope that the discussion will be continued. Before officially closing, I will just mention that in January we are going to have another webinar, and this time on national action plans in Africa. And what we have seen during this discussion, that there are a lot of problems, a lot of issues, and there is a lot of interest in this topic. And we are going to have Professor Swain from our academic network, as well as Abigail Ryan from Peace Women, and these three amazing ladies working on national action plans and on the implementation on women, peace and security in Nigeria, DRC, and Cameroon. So you will be able to hear about the first-hand experience of working with that. And that's basically it for today. If you still have any questions, please feel free to message them to me, and I will be forwarding them to our panelists. And also, just a few hours ago, we published a blog of the Swedish section of WILPF on feminist foreign policy, so it can be found on WILPF website. And yes, so thank you very much for today, and bye.
Bye.